You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Okay, so this is the second part of our podcast with Calum Nicholson on climate migration. And my next question would be that what is the current mainstream in climate migration? Or let's just focus on climate. What is the mainstream? You mentioned that science has a clear stand in that question, but what is it?
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that when we discuss climate change, you can't really talk about it without reference to the IPCC reports. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it has three working groups. Each produces a report. The first one is the science report, but they also have two other reports. There's mitigation and adaptation. So policies for how we mitigate human impact on climate. And adaptation, of course, is how does society adapt to climate change. The science report in the IPCC is very, very good. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist in my background, but both from my observation, but certainly speaking to people who not only are familiar with it, but also actually often can be quite critical of lots of stuff, the science is extremely good. There's basically almost no errors in it. There's a couple of typos over the years, but most of the things it said over the years have proven to be good science.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, and then so people who are critiquing the IPCC on the climate ground, on the science ground, or on themselves on, I think, quite shaky ground. However, the questions around mitigation and adaptation, which are really about society and economy and so on, those reports, in the words of one friend I have, they said actually those reports are closer to astrology than they are to astronomy. And I feel this is the case when we look at climate migration, because you started saying, well, what's the state of the art in climate migration? Well, I think it's relevant to climate change because the problem with the IPCC work, I think, is the adaptation side of it. Again, not because we don't understand the climate, but because it makes assumptions about ourselves, about society, which are actually difficult to prove, or even to understand what they're referring to. The state of the art on climate migration is actually very interesting right now. Because there was, for me, a bit of a watershed 4 years ago. After 15 or 20 years of a lot of papers on this topic, 4 years ago, there was an article published in Nature Climate Change, which is probably the biggest climate change journal. And this paper was called Climate Migration Myths. And it was an interesting paper because it was co-authored by 31 leading scholars on the topic. Household names in the world of climate migration. If your household is full of climate scholars, then these were household names. Otherwise, no one will know who they are. But I either knew personally or knew of virtually all the people who contributed to it. And the fascinating thing about that paper was the opening paragraph of the paper said, basically, we cannot identify the causal relationship between climate and migration. It's not simply a data issue, it's a conceptual issue. How do you separate climate from political economy? And basically, it acknowledged out of the gate something climate migration scholars have known for 15 years, that establishing causality is virtually impossible, and therefore identifying a climate migrant is virtually impossible. And what was weird or unusual about the paper was that it stated this not at the end, but rather at the beginning, that it was co-authored by 31 people, and that it was published in a leading journal on climate change. Now, they went on to say what we should do instead, and they said we should talk about climate mobility. Personally, I don't see how that would improve anything, because what is climate mobility? If it's the same as climate migration, you've got the same problem, and if it's not, then what are you talking about? And that's a different issue. But the interesting thing with the topic is it's reached a point where they kind of acknowledge they're not quite sure what they're talking about. And I don't mean that pejoratively in the sense of like they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, they literally say, we're not sure what precisely we're talking about. What is climate migration? Who is a climate migrant? It's really unclear. And so the state of the art right now is that no one really knows what this topic refers to. But the other thing that's happening right now is that it doesn't seem to matter. Because whereas 10, 12 years ago, if you made a claim about climate migration and said there were going to be this many climate migrants, most institutions like the IOM or any UN institution would say, okay, what's your evidence? So you had to prove to them that there's climate migration. What's interesting is because climate change has gained such currency politically, there's such forward momentum talking about climate change, that now the onus is on the opposite view to prove itself. So now they assume there is climate migration. And if you're a scholar who says, well, what's your evidence? In a sense, I've got to prove a negative rather than prove a positive. And so it's interesting that my sense is, in terms of the state of the art on climate migration, but by extension climate change, is that a lot of the questions around the significance of the discussion and the significance of the science are simply no longer being asked, because the political momentum of climate, the almost political economy of climate, has become so vast that these sort of fundamental questions are no longer being asked. And this is why if I sounded at the beginning a bit dismissive about COP, is that what you had was a constellation of empty slogans that refer to each other, but there's no depth to any of them.
But actually, in your chapter, you mentioned that this topic can be perceived in different ways, basically based on political affiliation, and it connects somewhat to the point you made earlier, that based on political views, we can see this issue differently. And can you sum up how can it shape our perception about climate migration?
Yeah, so climate migration is an interesting topic because it has a sort of bipartisan appeal. So both the left and the right, whatever the left and the right mean these days, but both sides of an argument tend to find climate migration an interesting topic. They both assume you can find climate migrants, but they have typically a different interest in climate migration. And I'm generalizing here, but in general, the left look at climate migration and they're interested in it from a perspective of human security, so the well-being of the migrant. Whereas the right, whatever the right means these days, tends to look at it from a perspective of national security, saying, well, okay, all these climate migrants, they're going to come here. They're going to swamp our borders and our economies and so on. Now, actually, these two are not mutually exclusive views. You can be worried about both. You can be worried about the well-being of the migrants and also them coming to Europe or something. But the problem is both sides share an assumption which I don't think is substantiated by the research, which is the assumption that we can identify a group of people called climate migrants as distinct from non-climate migrants, that we can distinguish a climate migrant from just an economic migrant, for instance. Because at the end of the day, people will be moving based on, because they can't earn a livelihood anymore, they can't support themselves, which is basically a political economic point. And also bear in mind there's other factors involved. So the trajectory and speed and numbers of people in any sort of migration is not strictly determined by the climate. There's lots of other considerations that go into it.
So you are saying basically that there are several factors behind one's decision to move abroad.
Yes, and I think there's a way of phrasing this which clarifies the point. The problem with a lot of research I find on climate migration is that the question is loaded. People say, let's go do research on climate migration. Now, if you say we're trying to look for climate migration, you'll probably find climate migration. But if instead you say, if you phrase the question as, let's go look at why people migrate, then you're not loading the question as climate migration.
Yes.
You go and determine, okay, well, what are the factors that actually cause people to migrate on their own terms? Because ultimately it's a matter of choice, so people's perceptions matter. So if you go to someone and you say, are you moving? And they say, yes. Say, why are you moving? And they may give you several reasons. But if you say, are you climate migrants? Then, of course, that loads the discussion. And so the climate migration topic is an interesting one like this, because people often say things like, what are the causes of climate migration? We need to work out the causes of climate migration. But obviously, if you've said it's climate migration, you've presumed the cause. There's a lot of sort of logical paradoxes in the discussion.
And actually, you just mentioned the paper published by these very famous scientists in the review, and I also am curious about your vision because in your chapter you mentioned several words, and I will enumerate a little bit of them, namely environmental refugee, environmental migrant, environmental displacement, climate refugee, climate migration, climate displacement, environmentally induced migration, climate-induced migration, etc., etc. There are several ones, and you aim to prove that these concepts often lack clarity and definition and what they were talking about, and amongst them, which of them are relevant in your opinion, and which are just purely synonyms and are irrelevant for science?
Well, the truth is, I think they're all synonyms. They are all engaging in the narcissism of small differences. They're distinctions without differences, because as you've just described, that there is a spectrum or a whole constellation of concepts that are referring to something loosely we could call environment or climate, and something else as an effect that we can loosely call migration or displacement or mobility or something, or refugees or whatever it is. And if you strip away the sort of surface level, by analogy, in biology you have a phenotype and a genotype. So the phenotype is what you look like, the genotype is your actual genes. So if you strip away the sort of phenotypic variation of these terms and look at what is genetic to all these terms, there is a very simple claim going on, which is there's a presumption that we can determine causality between some sort of non-societal factor that we call climate or environment.
Can we?
And some sort of social factor. Well, I would argue we can't. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you a very clear reason why we can't.
This is why this book is very critical of
and I think but let me give you kind of an analogy to explain why we can't.
Yes.
We're in a room right now recording this podcast. Imagine we were not here and it was just all the physical things in this room. If I had all the data on everything in the room, then all the weights and the mass of everything, and then I dropped a grenade in the middle of it, I could probably build a computer simulation to predict where all the pieces will go. I know how much explodes in the grenade, and you can model the impact, right? Now, if this room was full of people and I dropped a grenade in it, you couldn't actually predict what people would do. Some people would run out the room, some would freeze, and one crazy person would jump on the grenade.
Yes.
Okay, so it's you can't really predict how people will react to something. And I feel that's that's not a fault, that's a feature. That's being conscious, that's being human, is that we are not a unity, we're a plurality. The study of physical things is a unity. The laws of physics and chemistry apply equally to all things. But the entire point, I think, of the social sciences and the humanities is the base material we're working with, people, are not a unity in this sense. We are a plurality. We can have 20 people doing the same thing at the same time, and they all have a different view of it. They all have a different perspective. Again, it's not a fault, it's a feature. So the problem is when we try and generalize from the environment to climate, from the environment or climate to migration in a causal sense, we're presuming that human beings can be modeled like billiard balls can be modeled on a pool table. And I simply don't think it's true. We are multiple, we are plural in our mores, our forms of meaning, and that's just who we are. And so I think sometimes there's this sort of not scientific, but scientistic, this sort of scientific religion, this idea that society can just be understood like inanimate things. But there's a great quote on this from, I think it's Goethe, it might be Spengler. I think I read it in Spengler quoting Goethe, but I'm never too sure. But the quote's a great quote, and it goes, the means to understand dead forms is mathematical law, but the means to understand living forms is analogy. And I think it's
a really interesting point.
It is an interesting point, because I think we can mathematically model dead things in a sense. But once you throw consciousness into it, once you throw culture, once you throw people into it, in a sense, all bets are off. There may be some statistical patterns we can discern, but the statistics of the past are not necessarily a guide to the future. And anyone who's worked in finance knows that. And also, and even if you can find a pattern, it doesn't mean you can identify an individual. And the whole point of climate migration is that you're saying, okay, if you have two people arrive at your border and one says they're a climate migrant, or both say they're a climate migrant, and you have room for one, how do you work out which one's the valid case? So it does matter to identify it in individuals. It's not just something to be talked about at an abstract demographic level. Sure, there may be some sort of correlation between some hotter parts of the world and more migration or something. But also there's lots of other factors that come into that, because of course there's a whole history that a lot of the hotter places were colonized, their societies were disrupted through the colonial experience. There's a reason why when we think about climate migrants, that we're often thinking of them as coming from quite poor countries. No one's talking about German climate migrants, or indeed Norwegians. I've just been in Sweden last week. Sweden is very cold. It's an unlivable temperature if you don't have a good jacket.
Actually, it's a very good point.
Yeah, and we don't talk about it. Why? Because it's a wealthy economy. So actually, then it raises the question.
We are not talking about Swedish climate migrations because they can afford to have a very warm jacket.
Yeah, and but it's interesting that we think of climate migrants when we think of them. And indeed, if you go on Google and you type in climate migrant, what you're going to get is a picture of someone in India or in Africa on a dry riverbed or wading across water with their clothes on their head or something. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is that if it is climate migration, we're missing that the political economic context is usually poverty. But there's actually a second thing we're missing, which is worth mentioning very quickly, which is that if anyone's ever spent any time in rural India or rural Africa, and I used to live in rural India for a bit, is that you often when you see these images of people wading across a ford with clothes on their head, to European or Western eyes, this looks like a horrifying tragedy because this person has to wade across water with their possessions on their head. If you go to India, this is often just people getting to the village to go to market. It's just commuting. They don't have bridges. They don't have metalled roads. It's just the culture. Even the culture of carrying something on your head. For us, that's just if a terrible situation where the car's broken down. But, a lot of places in the world, people carry things on their head because actually, if you've ever tried doing it, it's much less tiring than carrying it under your arms,
It's understandable.
And the only reason I don't do it is that people will look at me strange in the street here because it's not the culture.
In our culture, yes.
Yeah, or in the UK. But it's an adaptive way of living. So the problem with climate migration sometimes is if you Google the images of a climate migrant, what you're seeing is an image that is true in the sense it's an image of, somewhere in rural India, for instance. But the meaning we give to that image tells us more about ourselves or reveals more about ourselves than it does about so-called climate migration, potentially. And it's so I think it's worth us having a bit more self-awareness in terms of the presumptions we bring to the stuff we see. The data doesn't speak to us. We make the data speak.
And we should interpret it.
Yeah, it's interpretation. And we need to be conscious of the power of interpretation, indeed, to mislead us from the truth.
And actually, the cover of your book shows a tree without leaves.
Yeah.
And it's about climate migration.
Yeah.
And I don't want to spoil why exactly this cover was applied on your book. But it's interesting that it's somewhat gray and depressing a little bit. But the explanation, but your explanation why you chose this book cover shows that it's a very controversial topic, and we shouldn't focus on getting as much attention as we can. Because it's not about sensation. It's about defining what is climate migration and how should we encounter the so-called concepts I enumerated, and what is true and what is not, and what is a paradigm and what is not. And I think that this is the end of the second part of our podcast, and we will continue with the third and last part.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.